Imagine you are King Charles II. Your father, Charles I, has been executed, and now you are king. You want to rebury his body at Westminster. The only problem? You can't find him. Now, for 150 years, no one, not even the royal family, knows where the body of Charles I is. But in 1813, they open a coffin, and what they find is not just Charles I, but also Henry VIII. This is not a video to miss, guys. In this video, I'm going to be telling you exactly what they found in those coffins and how they found them. Our unlucky king, Charles I, is born on the 19th of November in Scotland, Fife, at Dunfermline Castle. And he's actually not the heir intended. He has an older brother called Henry, a bit like Henry VIII. His older brother Henry dies young of typhoid, and he becomes the heir intended. Now, Charles I is actually quite strange for a monarch of this period. He has a really great relationship with his children, and we're going to hear some heartbreaking quotes later on from his daughter writing in her diary the last time she ever sees him. Now, he's known to be a good and loving father, which obviously in this period, royal children are raised in their own royal households. They're not raised by loving parents. But Charles I is known to have been a very kind man. He's also known to have been a very shy man, and this is what seems to have caused problems for him. So this wonderful relationship he has with his children does not seem to have been passed down to his courtiers, his lords and his barons. They seem to think of him as being awkward, a bit difficult and a little bit shy. And you have to wonder, with our view of the 21st century, if maybe he had some form of neurodivergence. He's a very kind man in private, but something about him in public just doesn't sit well with people. Now, he refuses to share power, and the reason this is, and this is what will lead to the bloody civil war, which will kill thousands of people and will eventually lead to his execution, is that Charles believes in divine right, and that means that he has been appointed by God and his authority comes only from God. And if you truly believe this about yourself, you cannot be challenged, can you? Because no one has the right to challenge you. But the reality is, in 1600, the king does not have absolute power. We do have a parliament. It's not like today where they have even less power, and it's not like, William the Conqueror where he had ultimate power. There is a balance here, and it seems like Charles really struggled with that. Now, he believes that to challenge his authority is to challenge God's authority. And actually, if you look at this painting, this is by Rubens. He had Rubens paint this picture, which kind of typifies this view of divine right. But the problem is that times are changing, and what we get is a civil war. And what you will see is that in this conflict, the royalists start off well, but the leader of the parliamentarians, Oliver Cromwell, he's a little bit of a military genius actually, and eventually the parliamentarians they gain the upper hand effectively. And what follows is one of the bloodiest conflicts that ever occurs on British soil. Now, Charles is captured and he's housed at Hampton Court Palace, that place where that Henry VIII once gave to Anne Boleyn. But he escapes, and fortunately he's caught again and he's kept prisoner this time at Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight. It seems that he's treated well, but Charles, and I think we probably understand this a little bit from his personality now, he completely refuses any form of compromise. He will not meet the parliamentarians, and we understand why, right? Because Charles fundamentally thinks that he's been appointed by God. So this guy who's telling him he needs to do this, that and the other, Charles cannot accept that. He's appointed by God, and therefore his instructions only come from God. So it's difficult for us as a 21st century people, because you think, well, if there's an execution at hand, I would rather just, tell them I'll do this, tell them I'll do that. But that's not what Charles thought. He is very religious. He believes in his right and that he's doing God's will. So he will not negotiate a peace deal. Eventually, he's sentenced to be executed, and he has a heartbreaking goodbye with his children. So he's known to have comforted his 11-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, with the words, "Sweetheart, you will forget this," which is just really sad. And she records this in her diary that evening. On Tuesday, the 30th of January, he's dressed in a thick shirt. And that's so, obviously it's January, it's freezing. He knows it's going to be cold. He doesn't want to be shivering out there on the scaffold and for people to think that he's trembling in fear. So he walks with his bishop across St James's Park. He's taken to his bedchamber in Whitehall to await the order to mount the scaffold. Imagine, this bedroom that you've used all of these years as king. I think he's been king for about 20 years at this point. And he's taken there and he waits there for about 3 hours. And then he walks under the painting that we looked at earlier, the Rubens one, which was in the banqueting hall. He commissioned that 20 years before. He crosses the black scaffold. He gives a short speech, but sadly the people that are watching this stood really far back and it's really windy and no one really hears what he says, which is sad. He is known to have said, though, I go from a corruptible but incorruptible crown where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in this world. Now, his hair is bound in a white nightcap. This is kind of standard to get the hair off the face, because obviously you've probably seen pictures of Charles. He has off the neck rather, you know that he has long hair. Knowing how Charles looks comes in really importantly later, where we're going to look at the body that we find and assess whether we think it's Charles or not. So he tells the examiner that he tells the executioner that he will say a short prayer and that he will give a signal when he's ready. And he says his prayer and he gives a signal and the axe comes down in one fell swoop. Now that is the written history, and it's really important to remember that, because when we examine the body later on, that's going to be important. Now you may or may not know the story of Margaret Pole, who was one of the worst bodged executions in British history. Effectively, when Henry was on his really mental kind of killing everyone spree at the end of his life, he kills Margaret Pole, who is George of Clarence's daughter, so she's kind of like a great cousin to him. She's the last Plantagenet, and she's an old woman by the time he decides to execute her, which is why it's a real tragic death. But effectively the executioner really bodges this executioner, and he basically hacks out, I think one of the blades lands in her shoulder, and so you're not going to get a clean cut. This is not the case with Charles I. The history says that it was one cut and off, and that's important because we're going to be examining the body later. Now, unlike unusual executions, which, this is like back in the Tudor period, they love an execution. It's like their Saturday night entertainment. They love that. They love hangings. They love executions. This one, guys, did not go down well. I've got a quote for you. This is not popular with the crowd at all. And the quote is, "There was such a groan by the thousands then present as I have never heard before, and I desire I may never hear again. Other people also believe in divine right. People are not comfortable with the execution of a king," okay? And this is the kind of sentiment that will get Charles II back from exile all those years later. Now, Charles I remains the only British monarch tried and executed for treason. But what happened to his body? Obviously, Cromwell and his cronies aren't going to go and give him, after executing him, they're not going to go and give him an incredible burial, or anywhere really where people can make a pilgrimage to, because there's a danger that you make him a martyr to the royalist cause. So they need to kind of get rid of the body quietly and carefully. But obviously there is, now we know where he's buried, you will know soon, there is obviously some kind of, still some reverence to put him somewhere where he belongs. And we're going to find out where that is. Now, there were actually two contemporary accounts of where the body of Charles I actually went, because Cromwell and his gang never published it. Now, in the History of Rebellion, which is a book by Edward Hyde, who's the first Earl of Clarence, and he's an advisor to both Charles I and Charles II, and he publishes this as early as 1702. And he says that the body of Charles I is known to be in St. George's Chapel in Windsor, but they didn't know where. Even in 1702, they don't know where. Now, actually, there is a Mr. Herbert who is a groom of the bedchamber, and he says that he knows exactly where the body is and that it is in with Henry VIII. But no one's really looking at that. Even though Herbert is saying this, the advisors of Charles II aren't really listening to this, and this is probably because people have got the opinion at the time that we should let dead kings be buried, because there was a lot of digging up and disinterring of people in this period. So letting Charles I sleep is actually probably a really good idea. Now, we come to the 19th century. So the Prince Regent, him of Regency fame, he wants to build a vault underneath St. George's Chapel. Now, if you watch the funeral of Prince Philip in particular, you might remember that at the end of the funeral service, his body was at the front of the chapel and it was kind of lowered down. Now, he was interred in the vault that we're talking about, and he was interred there only temporarily until Queen Elizabeth died, and then they've both been moved to a separate chapel now. But the vault that Prince Philip was originally buried in is the one that we're talking about. So this was being built in the early 19th century by the Prince Regent. And when they were constructing this, they needed to build a passage underneath the choir. Now, as they did so, the builders accidentally knocked a little aperture in the wall. And they put their eye to it, as you do. You know, if you watch the Byron video, you know, people any chance they get, if they will always look, they will always create some fantastic excuses to why they had to look for scientific purposes, you know, but they will look. So anyway, they look into the little vault, and what do they find? They know that here is Henry VIII's tomb, and they know that in there are the bodies of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Now that is an interesting topic on its own, because there is a lost tomb of Henry VIII. He was supposed to have had a whole other tomb. I'll make a video on it. Henry VIII is not the kind of guy to be quietly buried beneath the choir, right? That was not supposed to happen. Anyway, he is buried beneath the choir, but when they look in through the little chink, they see not two coffins as they were expecting, Henry and Jane. They actually see 3. Now, one of these coffins is covered with a black pall, so effectively a black cloth. And so the builders talk about this, they go to the Prince Regent, and they all decide that they are going to open the vault. Now, a member of the party that goes into this vault is Sir Henry Halford. Now, he's a doctor, and he accompanies the Prince Regent. He's one of the members of this party that goes in there. Now, luckily for us, he records everything, the whole experience, because of course you would, right, in his diary, and this is the source that I am using to tell you about what was in that vault. So this guy was actually there, and this is a first-hand account. So what did they find? So they went in and they removed the pall, and what they found was a simple leaden coffin. So there was no appearance of it ever having been enclosed in wood. So why this is interesting is usually there would be a lead coffin. There would be a bit, not as elaborate as Egyptian coffins, but certainly there would usually be a few layers, especially for someone with the status of Charles I. However, because of the circumstances of Charles I's death, it actually does make sense that Charles would be given no honours, so he is buried in a simple lead coffin. That makes sense to me, that is what he would receive, and that is what they find. So there is no outer coffin. Sometimes the outer coffin can disintegrate, but there's no evidence of any coffin, no wood chippings, nothing like that. It looks like all he ever had was a lead coffin. I think that fits. On the front there's a plaque that says King Charles I, 1648. Now, because we've had the groom of the bedchamber saying that he went in with Henry VIII, we've now got a leaden coffin, and we've got a plaque on it that says Charles I. All of this suggests to me, we should be critical, right? We should never take anything at face value. All of this stuff, to me, feels like this is Charles I, but we still need to look at the body. So let's open the coffin. So inside, what they find is copious amounts of cerecloth. So cerecloth is like a muslin gauze, and it's covered with an unctuous grease, think like Vaseline. And basically, in this period, what they do is they use this wax cloth to try and help preserve the body. It's fitting with the time. It's something we would expect to see. So Henry Halford and his cronies, they remove the cerecloth. There's loads of it in there. And finally, they can see the face of Charles I. Now, I'm going to read directly to you what Halford finds. So he says, at length, the whole face was disengaged from its covering. He's talking about the cerecloth there. The complexion of it was dark and discoloured. That's what we'd expect to find. It's been dead for hundreds of years. The forehead and temples had lost little or nothing of their muscular substance. The cartilage of the nose was gone, but the left eye in the first moment of exposure was open and full, though it vanished almost immediately. I think basically now the eye was preserved, but now it's been exposed to the air, it kind of disintegrates. And the pointed beard, so characteristic of the period of the reign of King Charles, was perfect. So it looks like him effectively. The shape of the face was a long oval, many of the teeth remained, and the left ear, in consequence of the interposition of the unctuous matter between it and the cerecloth, was found in its entirety. When the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachments which confined it, it was found to be loose, and without any difficulty was taken up and held to view. It was quite wet, and gave a greenish red tinge to the paper and to the linen which touched it. The back part of the scalp was entirely perfect. I'm not going to read any further, but then he goes on to talk about the head is separate from the body, which is a really interesting piece of information. And so he says that the neck is transected at C4 and the divided portions are smooth and even. Now, remember we talked about how in the history the blade came down just one time. So what we're seeing is a clean incision, and that is what we would see with someone who's been executed in just one blow. Because what you would see, if the axe had come down several times, you would see jagged muscles, you might see tearing. We're not seeing that. This is a clean transection. So the party is then pretty happy. They think it looks like Charles, everything seems to fit. They decide that this is Charles I, okay? It looks like him, the injuries fit. Now, for good measure, they decide to have a peek at Henry VIII because he's right there. Now, what's interesting about Henry VIII is what they note in the text is that Henry VIII's coffin is very badly damaged, and you can actually see his skeleton without opening the coffin. They don't open the coffin, they can literally just peek in. And he uses the phrase something like some violence has been done to it. So likely what has happened is when the men brought in the body of Charles I, they've damaged, I hope accidentally, they've damaged, unless they hacked it open, because Halford uses the words some violence. Henry VIII's coffin is completely smashed in the front, which probably isn't just going to happen. And you can kind of see Cromwell's men not really giving a shit about the body of, you know, preserving the coffin of Henry VIII. So Halford and his pals decide to kind of have a peek in there at Henry VIII. So they note that his coffin is 6 feet 10 inches. It's enclosed in elm, though a lot of this is decayed. You have to remember that at this point Henry VIII has been dead for a really long time, hundreds of years. This is 1813. But he's got an elm coffin that's decayed. The leaden coffin, which is underneath, that's broken and exposed, and you can see his skeleton through it. Some beard remains. So by 1813, where else can you learn this stuff, guys? Honestly, like in 1813, Henry VIII has a skeleton, and some of his beard remains, incidentally. But there's nothing else remarkable about the skeleton. So unlike Charles I, where they're able to say confidently they feel that this is Charles I, there's nothing remarkable about Henry VIII other than the fact the body is where it should be, and you know, it's got a beard, and that's all that's remarkable about it. Now, they don't disturb the coffin of Jane Seymour, and there's also a baby's coffin in there as well, and they don't disturb that either. And so the mystery is solved. Charles I rests with both Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, and really interesting that they end up resting together, because Henry VIII is a man who was really pretty awful but managed to hold on to power, and it sounds like Charles I was a really nice guy and actually was completely devoured by the monarchy. And so they rest together with Jane Seymour and this little infant. And if you go to St George's Chapel at Windsor, you can be close to the vault. You obviously can't see it, it's underneath the choir, and you're not allowed to film in there. So I have been, but I couldn't get any footage for you. You're not allowed to film in St George's Chapel, but it is there, and you can walk past it and be close to the bodies of Henry VIII. Actually, if you do go, there is a plaque which says Henry VIII, but his body is actually not anywhere near there. It's actually to the side underneath the choir. I hope you loved this video, guys. I thought it was really cool to find such an old text and to dig into it and to find out what Henry VIII looked like in 1813. That is awesome to me. So if you're interested in this video, please do like and sub, because it helps small channels like mine. Do check out the Byron video, which is kind of similar. We looked into Byron's tomb. We've actually got pictures inside Byron's tomb, which is awesome. And I've got a Bronte video, all kinds of great stuff. So I would love to see you. Please do leave me a comment. Thanks.